harp is one of the most beautiful sounding instruments you will ever hear, but it tends not to get the same amount of attention as the piano or the violin. There are so many amazing harp pieces that don't get the recognition they deserve. Today, we're exploring 5 most beautiful harp pieces. Let's dive right into it. First piece is gonna be Ravel's Introduction e Allegro. I'm gonna first give you some of my thoughts on the piece, like throughout listening to the piece, and then I'll give you some background. So when I tell you, my jaw hit the floor when I first listened to it. There are no other words to describe this piece other than beautiful. The opening begins with this soft, breathy flute followed by strings. The flute evokes like a soft cry, then builds up in harmony with the harp. In this piece, the slow entrance of the flute, it's like a nod to a feature in Haydn's symphonies, like the soft entrance. It just feels like heaven. It kind of encapsulates you into this new world. The arpeggios from the harp create this like very mystical feeling. This piece shifts to something more playful, with the highlight of shorter, choppier notes, but the melody in the lower register remains a prominent feature. You can always notice the different voices in this piece, and you could always switch from one to the other. I commonly find myself switching from the harp to the flute when I'm listening to this piece. It's like having a conversation, the way that the two different sounds crash and mold into each other. When I think of this piece, I think I'm sitting next to the beautiful gleaming sea or like rolling hills. I feel surrounded by nature. This piece was composed in 1905 during the Impressionist music period. This piece is basically a harp concerto, however Ravel reduced it from a solo concerto to something chamber size. The instruments included are harp, flute, clarinet, and a string quartet, so 2 violins, viola, and cello. This was likely done to make the piece feel more intimate and highlight each instrument. This intimate, delicate feeling just can't be captured with a virtuoso concerto. And Ravel was an impressionist, and his influences are heavily seen in this piece. For instance, he focused on creating moods and atmosphere from music using evocative sounds and textures, and you can clearly hear that throughout his works. His innovation on tonality, such as the added note chords, which were actually inspired by Wagner, and they create so much more complex harmonic identity. There's this inherent ambiguity in his chords. For instance, the opening seems to be in G flat major, but when later played in a lower register, it sounds like E flat minor. His attitude toward this piece was surprisingly neutral, and he never really mentioned it. It was actually omitted from his catalog of works and never ever mentioned in his autobiography, and that's so shocking because such a beautiful piece is just ignored. I think that's the case with most harp pieces, and they're just like simply disregarded or not as appreciated as other pieces, and this is why I'm doing this video, man. So like give it a listen. So if you fall in love with it as much as I did, then our next piece will be very similar, so buckle up. Moving on to our second piece, Debussy, Danse Sacrée et Danse Profane. This piece is divided in 2 sections, so Danse Sacrée and Danse Profane. So our first part, Danse Sacrée, which translates to sacred dance, is much more serene. So the melody is intoxicating, and at the beginning, it's like a voice and like an echo at the same time. Like the lush strings paired with the harp makes it almost sound like you're in a dream. So Debussy was deeply attracted to symbolism and the literary movement of the 19th century. He was very attentive to like the most mysterious aspects of reality, and you can truly see that in this piece. I don't know why, but some parts reminded me of like a medieval chant, which could also tie into the title. Later, the melody from the strings makes it almost sound like a choir. Here, Debussy uses like non-functional harmonies to kind of give it a sense that it's like almost floating in the air, and it's so like relaxed. It makes me feel like I'm in the clouds. And the second part, Danse Profane, which translates to secular dance, is much more joyous. So the dictionary might translate it to irreverent or blasphemous, but it actually means secular. It kind of really emphasizes the waltz part of this piece. It's a much more lively, and it just reminds me of like flowers blooming. And there's this like vast contrast in dynamics and rhythm. 1 minute it's calm and serene, next fast and lively. Like the 2 pieces are just kind of like polar opposite of each other, if I could say. And the harp kind of makes it sound like it's bubbling, and it's so beautiful. This piece was composed in 1904, a year before the previous piece we talked about, and it shares a lot of ties with it. So this piece was scored for harp, violin 1-2, viola, cello, and double bass. And this work was commissioned by the instrument-making firm called the Plelo Company, and they wanted to show off their newly developed chromatic harp. So the chromatic harp differed from the more commonly known version we know, the concert harp or pedal harp, where chromatic notes were created by extra strings, while the pedal harp created that effect with pedals. So this dance's archaic style, which included modal harmonies, expressed a sacred rite in one piece and a contrasting secular dance of joy. And this piece was an instant hit, but the chromatic harp was not. So some critics called it curious and alluring, and some called it unpleasant. But by the second performance, it was replaced by the pedal harp, so it kind of died down. So even though Debussy strongly denied being an impressionist, as he was afraid it would undermine his originality, he was actually very irritated when people called him an impressionist. His music actually shares the same luminous characteristics as the paintings and contemporary impressionists like Monet's paintings, and it also shares some characteristic as Ravel's pieces. And honestly, I don't understand why he doesn't accept, he refuses to be called an impressionist. His pieces are undeniably impressionistic, and he shares the same luminous characteristics. And I'm thinking maybe he didn't want to be put in the box. Like, I don't know. I would take the compliment, man. But let's move on. So next up, Camille Saint-Saëns' Fantasy for Harp and Violin, Opus 124. And the piece kind of begins with a series of harp glissandos, chords, and it's characterized by the different moods and textures. So the melody is so lush and beautiful. The violin feels like a soft voice, and the piece almost feels like a conversation between the harp and the violin. And later on, the piece suddenly gets more dramatic and shifts into a minor key. And it's so passionate yet calm. The two instruments complement one another in different ways as the work makes its way through a series of episodes. So at first, the violin sings like the solo line, accompanied by the harp, so the violin's solo. And then later, the roles are not very clearly defined anymore. They kind of like mesh together. And eventually, it kind of switches. So the violin kind of provides support for the virtuosic activity in the harp, and it really highlights the glissandos. So Saint-Saëns wrote this piece at the age of 72. Can you believe it? He was 72. Can you imagine being 72 and writing such a wonderful masterpiece? This was composed in 1907, so a few years after our two pieces before. He wrote around 3 major harp works in his life. The Fantasy for Solo Harp in 1893, which is also beautiful. It was the second of 3 major harp works by Saint-Saëns. And so this piece actually kind of used the harp to replace the piano and create a very delicate, magical feeling. This piece kind of reflects Saint-Saëns' style, very clear, very balanced, charming, well crafted. That's what makes this piece so beautiful, and you should definitely check this piece out as well. Alright, moving on to our fourth piece, Harp Sonata by Hindemith. So this piece was split into 3 sections. It begins with a few glissandos, and then the multiple grazing of strings of the harp, and then it becomes mysterious, a little bit almost pitter-pattering, climbing some sort of stairs, and it gets faster and it crashes into a chord, but it's so graceful. Throughout the whole piece, all 3 movements, you can hear the build of the lower voice, and I say it doesn't necessarily follow the Romantic era techniques. It's definitely leaning more towards the contemporary techniques. It's very elegant, and then it gets more solemn and mysterious. There's also this repetition of alternating high and low notes, and the piece is not formally structured like a classical era piece, and it kind of goes with the flow, how nature works. But there's a lot of depth to this piece, which I love it, and it gives it so much feeling. And the second piece section is very lively and much shorter, and the glissandos are truly a highlight of that section. And the third section is so serene, calm, and slowed down, and it's really, truly beautiful. So Hindemith was a leading German and American composer of the 20th century. This was composed around 1939, so this would have been one of his first works. This piece came a few decades after all of our previous pieces. He was influenced by early Romantic and Expressionist movements, movements. So beware, expressionists and impressionists are very different. So expressionist music is all about atonal style, emotional intensity and dissonance, and impressionist is all about creating like an atmosphere, subtle harmonic textures to depict like a certain mood and like tying it to nature. And it's really like these two movements are really contrasting. So Hindemith followed the expressionist, the atonal, the sharp dissonance style, and this was actually, you can tie that into Schoenberg, who was actually known as the father of atonality. But yet that's what makes this piece so interesting. Last but not least, let's talk about our fifth piece, Alice Coltrane's Jazz Harp Solo from Jazz Jamboree. Here we're talking about a harp composition from Alice Coltrane, the iconic jazz musician and composer, and she's known for her spiritual music. What's really unique about this piece is that it's an improvised jazz piece, and right from like the start, this piece was incredibly engaging. There was like a section at the beginning of the piece that really stood out to me. Like there was like this frantic glissandos, the climbing strings. It was such a unique and thrilling moment, and there was so much contrast throughout this whole piece. And I just have to say, the fact that this was all improvised is mind-blowing. I watched the performance on YouTube, and seeing her facial expression just made it so heartwarming. And one of the comments kind of described this best, but the way that she looks, the way that she treats her harp, her instrument, is like almost like a mother brushing her daughter's hair. It's so caring, it's so loving. Alice Coltrane was a groundbreaking American jazz pianist, harpist, and composer, and spiritualator. She pursued a solo career and she released over a dozen albums, and she started really diving into jazz, classical Indian music, gospel, and avant-garde jazz even. She often really incorporated the harp into jazz, and it was like really rare, which is why this piece is so beautiful and so iconic, and you should really check it out. I really recommend it. It's so beautiful. Alright, that's it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through some of my most current favorite harp pieces. Your support means everything to me. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, let me know your thoughts. And again, this is just my personal interpretation, but I love to hear yours. So if you want to learn more about underrepresented female composers, check out my video on the top 6 most iconic female composers, and my most recent video on Shostakovich if you want to learn more and have more deep dives into composers. Let me know if you want me to do other video themes. Let me know in the comment section, and have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Keep listening and learning. Bye!